It was a warm afternoon in Harmony Falls, the kind of small town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. On this day, the streets bustled with the usual chatter, but something unexpected was about to shatter the town's fragile peace. Amelia Brooks, a bright, ambitious 16-year-old with a head full of beautiful natural curls, was walking home from the community library. She had spent hours researching for her upcoming debate tournament, her dreams of becoming a lawyer feeling closer with each page she turned. Amelia loved her town despite its flaws. She often tried to see the good in people, even when their actions suggested otherwise. But today, as she walked along the main street, she felt a sudden sense of unease. A patrol car rolled up slowly behind her, the kind that everyone in Harmony Falls recognized instantly. Officer Brent Mallory, a figure whose very name sent chills through certain parts of the community, was driving. Known for his heavy-handed tactics and questionable behavior, Officer Mallory carried an air of authority that was more intimidating than reassuring. Amelia quickened her pace, hoping to avoid an encounter, but the sound of the siren blipping briefly froze her in her tracks. She turned, her heart pounding, as the patrol car came to a stop. Mallory stepped out, adjusting his sunglasses and scanning her with a cold, piercing look. "Young lady," he called out, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few nearby onlookers. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. Mind answering a few questions?" Amelia was stunned. Her pulse raced as she struggled to understand what was happening. "What do you mean, sir?" "I haven't done anything wrong," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with fear. Mallory smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "We'll see about that. Hands where I can see them." The next few minutes unfolded in a blur. Without giving her a chance to explain, Mallory accused Amelia of loitering and being a public disturbance, charges that were as baseless as they were absurd. Before she knew it, he was leading her to the patrol car. The few bystanders who had stopped to watch seemed too afraid to intervene. But the worst was yet to come. At the station, Mallory escalated the situation, claiming Amelia needed to be processed for further questioning. It was there in the cold, sterile room of the precinct that the unthinkable happened. Using his badge as justification, Mallory ordered Amelia's hair to be shaved, insisting it was part of the protocol. His tone was indifferent, his actions cruel. Amelia's tears flowed freely as she begged him to stop, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Mallory's actions were calculated, driven by something far darker than enforcing the law. It wasn't about protocol. It was about power, about humiliation. He watched with an unsettling satisfaction as Amelia's vibrant curls fell to the floor, completely ignoring her cries and the horrified expressions of other officers who stood silently nearby. But what Mallory didn't know was that his actions were being recorded. One of the younger officers, Officer Jenna Hayes, had quietly captured the entire ordeal on her body camera. Jenna, new to the force and already disillusioned by Mallory's behavior, knew she couldn't stand by any longer. As Mallory finished his cruel task, Amelia sat silently, her shoulders shaking as she tried to contain her sobs. It was a sight that made Jenna's heart ache. She knew she had to act, but doing so would mean going against a senior officer, a risk that could end her career. Still, Jenna made her decision. 10 minutes later, as Mallory returned to his desk, confident in his authority and untouchable arrogance, he heard the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking. He turned in shock, only to find himself face to face with Jenna, her expression steely and resolute. "Officer Mallory," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "You're under arrest for abuse of power, assault, and unlawful actions." The room fell silent, every pair of eyes now on Mallory as the weight of his actions began to sink in. But this was only the beginning. Amelia's story was far from over, and the truth about Mallory's history of misconduct was about to unravel in ways no one in Harmony Falls could have anticipated. Officer Mallory's face turned a shade of crimson that seemed to radiate his disbelief. His mouth opened to protest, but no words came out. The weight of the cuffs on his wrists was a stark reminder that this time, his badge wouldn't shield him from the consequences. Jenna's grip was firm, her resolve unshaken despite the murmurs spreading through the precinct like wildfire. Other officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Mallory had been a commanding presence for years, and many had either turned a blind eye to his actions or been too afraid to challenge him. But today was different. Amelia sat quietly in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Her scalp still stung, not just from the physical act, but from the sheer humiliation of it all. She avoided looking at anyone, but out of the corner of her eye, She noticed Jenna standing tall, her expression unreadable but her actions speaking volumes. For the first time that day, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope, though it was faint and fragile. As Jenna led Mallory toward the holding area, his protests finally burst out in a rush of anger. "This is ridiculous. You're making a career-ending mistake, Hayes. You have no idea who you're messing with." Jenna didn't flinch. "You should have thought about your career before abusing your authority, Officer Mallory," she replied evenly. Her words echoed through the hallway as they passed other officers, some of whom turned away, unwilling to meet Jenna's eyes. Meanwhile, back in the main room, the precinct was buzzing with a mix of tension and uncertainty. Amelia noticed a few officers whispering among themselves, their expressions a blend of concern and guilt. One of them, a kind-looking man named Officer Daniels, hesitated before approaching her. He knelt to her level, his voice soft but steady. "Are you okay, kid?" he asked, his tone laced with genuine concern. Amelia shrugged, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know. I just want to go home." Daniels nodded, his jaw tightening. He had been on the force long enough to see how power could corrupt, but witnessing what Mallory had done to this young girl made his stomach turn. "We'll get this sorted out," he promised. "You won't have to go through this alone." Amelia wasn't sure if she believed him, but she appreciated the kindness. It was a stark contrast to the cold indifference she'd endured earlier. Daniel stood and gestured for another officer to escort Amelia to a safer, quieter space where she could wait for her parents. The officer, a woman named Carla, gently guided Amelia out of the room, offering her a bottle of water and a reassuring smile. As the door closed behind them, Daniels turned his attention to the growing tension among his colleagues. Some were openly questioning Jenna's actions, while others seemed relieved that someone had finally stood up to Mallory. It was clear that this wasn't just about one incident. Mallory's behavior had cast a long shadow over the precinct for years. Why didn't anyone stop him before? A younger officer muttered, his voice barely audible but filled with frustration. Daniel sighed, his gaze heavy. Because fear has a way of keeping people quiet, but fear doesn't make it right. In the holding area, Mallory sat in a cell fuming. His mind raced as he tried to figure out how to turn the situation around. He'd always relied on his connections and reputation to shield him, but this time felt different. Jenna's unwavering stance had rattled him more than he cared to admit. He glared at her through the bars, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? This isn't going to end well for you." Jenna met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Mallory, I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who's tired of watching people like you get away with everything." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Jenna had joined the force with a sense of purpose, believing in justice, and the idea that police officers were meant to protect and serve. But she had quickly learned that the reality was far more complicated. Mallory was just one of many who had twisted that purpose into something unrecognizable. But he was the one she had the chance to stop. Outside the precinct, news of the incident was already spreading. A witness who had seen Mallory stop Amelia on the street had taken a video and shared it online. The clip didn't capture everything, but it showed enough to spark outrage. Within hours, hashtags demanding justice for Amelia began trending on social media. People from all walks of life weighed in, sharing their own stories of mistreatment and calling for accountability. Amelia's parents, Carla and Marcus Brooks, arrived at the precinct soon after. Their faces were a mixture of worry and anger as they rushed to their daughter's side. Carla immediately pulled Amelia into a tight embrace, her hands trembling as she ran them over her daughter's newly shaved head. "Oh, baby," Carla whispered, her voice breaking. "What did they do to you?" Amelia couldn't hold back her tears any longer. "I didn't do anything, Mom. I promise. He said it was protocol." Marcus clenched his fists, his jaw set in a hard line. "This isn't protocol. This is abuse." His voice was low but filled with barely contained rage. Turning to Officer Daniels, he demanded answers. "Who's responsible for this?" Daniels hesitated before replying. "Officer Mallory, but he's been arrested and an investigation is already underway. I'm so sorry for what happened to your daughter. She didn't deserve this." Carla and Marcus exchanged a look, their emotions a storm of anger, sorrow, and determination. They weren't going to let this end here. This wasn't just about Amelia. It was about every other child, every other person who might have suffered under Mallory's hand. As the Brooks family prepared to leave the precinct, Jenna approached them, her expression sincere. "I can't undo what happened," she said, her voice steady but filled with regret. "But I promise you, I'll do everything I can to make sure he's held accountable." Carla studied Jenna for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But this is bigger than just him. The whole system needs to change." Jenna couldn't argue with that. She had seen firsthand how corruption and complacency could take root, and she knew that Mallory was just one piece of a much larger problem. But for now, she focused on the immediate task at hand, ensuring that justice was served for Amelia. As the Brooks family walked out of the precinct, the weight of the day pressed heavily on them. But they weren't alone. The community, both online and offline, was beginning to rally around them. And inside the precinct, the ripple effects of Mallory's arrest were just beginning to take hold. Jenna knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be pushback, possibly even retaliation. But as she stood in the quiet hallway, staring at the closed door of the holding area where Mallory sat, she felt a sense of resolve she hadn't known before. This wasn't just about one girl or one officer. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. And Jenna was ready to fight. As the Brooks family left the precinct, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove, his knuckles white with tension. Carla sat in the passenger seat, her fingers brushing over Amelia's hand, a silent gesture of comfort as her daughter stared out the window, lost in her thoughts. The silence in the car was heavy, filled with unspoken words and emotions that none of them could quite put into sentences yet. Carla finally broke the silence, her voice low but firm. "This isn't over. We can't let it be over." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "We'll make sure it's not. But we need to be careful. People like Mallory don't just go down without a fight." Amelia shifted in the back seat, her voice small but determined. "I don't want to be scared. I want him to pay for what he did." Her parents exchanged a glance in the front seat. They could see the strength in Amelia's eyes, but they also saw the pain behind it. She was a fighter, just like her mother and father, but this was a fight no 16-year-old should ever have to face. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the fallout from Mallory's arrest was beginning to take shape. Jenna sat in the break room, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee she hadn't touched. Officer Daniels joined her, his expression cautious but supportive. "You really did it," he said after a moment, sitting across from her. "You stood up to Mallory. Not many people would have." Janet looked up, her face tired but resolute. "Someone had to. What he did to that girl, it was too far. It's always been too far." Daniels nodded but leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know this isn't just about Mallory, right? He's been protected for years. Someone high up has been covering for him, and they're not going to let this slide." Jenna's jaw tightened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her. The system she had believed in, the one she had sworn to uphold, was more fractured than she'd realized. Still, she knew she couldn't back down now. Later that night, as the precinct settled into an uneasy quiet, Jenna began reviewing the footage from her body camera. It wasn't just what Mallory had done to Amelia. It was the way he carried himself, the calculated cruelty in his actions. This wasn't an isolated incident. She was sure of it. If she could find proof of a pattern, she might be able to expose the larger web of corruption that allowed someone like Mallory to thrive for so long. As she combed through the footage, her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from an unknown number. The text was short but chilling. "Be careful who you trust. They're watching." Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She quickly locked her phone and glanced around the room, the shadows suddenly feeling darker and more threatening. She wasn't sure who had sent the message, but the implication was clear. Someone didn't want her digging any deeper. At the Brooks family home, the evening was no less tense. Carla was on the phone with a civil rights attorney, explaining what had happened and trying to figure out the next steps. Marcus was in the kitchen, pacing as he checked updates on social media. She printed out copies of the most damning evidence and slid them into a folder, her mind racing with the implications. Taking down Mallory was one thing, but exposing the systemic corruption in the department was a much bigger fight, and one that could cost her everything. As she prepared to present her findings to the district attorney, her phone buzzed again. This time the message was more direct. "Drop it, Hayes. You don't want to make enemies." Jenna stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. She didn't know who was sending these messages, but the intent was clear. Someone was trying to scare her into silence. But instead of backing down, the threats only strengthened her resolve. She knew she was on the right track, and she wasn't about to let fear stop her. The protests outside grew louder as tensions escalated. A line of officers stood at the precinct's entrance, their expressions stoic as they faced the chanting crowd. Among the protesters were members of the Brooks family's church, local activists, and even people who had driven from neighboring towns to show their support. The energy was electric, but the presence of riot police stationed nearby was a stark reminder of how quickly things could take a turn. Amia, watching from her room, felt a pang of anxiety as she saw the police forming a tighter perimeter. She turned to her mother, who had just hung up the phone. "What if something bad happens out there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carla crouched beside her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is what change looks like, Amia. It's messy and scary, but it's necessary. Those people out there, they're standing up for you, for all of us. And we're going to do our part too." Marcus joined them, his voice steady but serious. "We need to prepare for whatever comes next. The lawyers are saying we have a strong case, but this isn't just about winning in court. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the family rallied together, Jenna was in a meeting with the district attorney, laying out the evidence she had gathered. The DA, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter, listened intently, her expression growing graver with each passing moment. When Jenna finished, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "This is explosive, Officer Hayes," Evelyn said. "If we move forward with this, it's not just Mallory who'll be implicated. There are higher-ups who will do everything in their power to discredit us." "I understand," Jenna replied, her voice resolute. "But this needs to come out. People need to know the truth." Evelyn nodded, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "Then we better be ready for a fight." Outside, the protest had reached its boiling point. A small group of agitators, unaffiliated with the main crowd, began shouting obscenities and throwing objects at the police line. The officers, already on edge, moved in to contain the situation, and the peaceful protesters found themselves caught in the chaos. The sound of a stun grenade echoed through the street, sending people scattering. Amia watched in horror as the live stream on her phone showed the scene unfolding. Protesters were yelling for calm, trying to de-escalate, but the tension was too high. She turned to her parents, panic in her voice. "We have to do something." Carla and Marcus exchanged a look, their own fear mirrored in each other's eyes. "We can't go out there," Marcus said firmly. "It's too dangerous. But we can make sure our voices are heard in another way." As the family prepared to release a public statement through their lawyer, Jenna stepped out of the precinct to face the chaos. She knew this was about more than one man or one family. This was about a community demanding accountability, a reckoning that had been a long time coming. As she approached the protesters, she felt the weight of her badge and the responsibility it carried. This was her moment to decide which side of history she wanted to stand on. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with the anticipation of what would happen next. The voices of the crowd rose in unison, calling for justice, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in shadows. Everyone, from the protesters to the officers to the Brooks family watching from their home, felt it, the moment when everything could change. But whether that change would bring healing or further division remained to be seen.